As I shared, I'm co-convener of National Ability Summit, and I have wheatish skin and very big eyes, at least I think. My hair is in a bun, and I'm wearing a polka dot dress with a yellow sweater. Now let's get to the real juice and the meat and the potatoes of National Ability Summit. Why is it so important, the topic of digital accessibility? Well, NAS has become this think tank where folks in the disability sector can share their learning curves through concrete action points that can take forward the world to a collective level. And it's extremely difficult to deny that digitalization has come into our radar in a very big way, mostly because of COVID-19. Digital accessibility has provided greater access to people with and without disabilities. But there are spaces that are grappling with their own challenges of becoming digitally accessible. So that's why at NAS, we feel it's really important to connect with leaders around the world that are pushing this envelope on disability inclusion through digital accessibility. And Shilpi Kapoor is one of those people. She's the moderator for this panel, and I'm amazed to hear that, Shilpi's got over 20 years of experience focusing and implementing accessibility for customers worldwide. And she wears many, many hats. The founder of BarrierBreak, 247 Accessible Documents, and Newshook. And she's on the board of some amazing non-for-profits that advocate and promote digital accessibility, like 3G ICT. Shilpi's even won numerous awards and has been on many impressive lists, such as the top 15 women transforming India list, and was one of the top 20 most powerful women in 2017, according to Business Today magazine. Hi, Shilpi.
Hi, Grishma.
So I'd love for you to do an image description of yourself and then answer this one question. So you are working with BarrierBreak and you're connecting with people around the world, but how are you doing it? Are you doing it at a policy level, a governmental level? Are you doing it at an advocacy level? Can you tell us more about how you're pushing that envelope of digital accessibility around the world?
Thank you for having me here, Varija and Grishma. Happy to be a part of National Ability Summit. So just to give a description of myself, I'm actually 5 foot nothing, as I laugh about, long hair, wearing a beautiful purple color sari today with a lovely green blouse, and speaking to you from Mumbai. So just to give a little bit of background about what Grishma asked me, and what is the work that we do within BarrierBreak. So what we tend to do is we look at accessibility from the lens of advocacy policy, but more from the lens of sustainable business models. So we provide services globally to customers, but as a company, we are very rooted in doing advocacy and policy within India, as well as globally with organizations like G3ICT. So that's really a little about me, Grishma. Can I introduce my panel now? That's what I'm really, really waiting for.
Yes, let me pass the baton to you. Thank you so much.
Fabulous. So today I have, two amazing colleagues from across the globe that I'm going to be speaking to. Léonie is somebody that I have always looked up to. Léonie, I don't think I've ever said this to you, but she is this amazing person who went on to start an organization called TetraLogical. But I think the first time I ever heard of Léonie was, in the web standards world, and for her work at W3C. So Léonie, I am so happy to have you here. And I love what you've done with Inclusive Design 24, ID24, the conference that you co-host and co-moderate. And I'm looking forward to this conversation. So Léonie, do you want to just introduce yourself and your visual introduction before we move on to you?
I will do. I have purple shoulder length hair that today is clasped up at the back of my head. So I think I'm color coordinated with your sari, maybe, Shilpi.
Like
I'm in my usual outfit of black jeans, boots, and jumper. I'm not very colorful when it comes to my clothes, I'm afraid to say. and I'm calling in from Bristol in the southwest of England.
Fabulous. With Léonie, we've got Neil Milliken. Neil is somebody who, again, is a dear colleague from the UK. Neil is the VP, Global Head of Accessibility at ATOS. Neil is somebody who is working to ensure the world is a better place by delivering better technology for ATOS's customers and their staff. Somebody that I admire for the way that he has managed to link business with accessibility and to get organizations to look at accessibility seriously. Lovely to have you here, Neil. Would love for you to describe yourself.
Excellent. So yes, I'm Neil. I'm a middle-aged white male with a close-cropped beard, a typical English disregard for orthodontistry, and I have blue eyes and a stripy jumper, which I realize is probably not the best thing for video effects, because I can see it strobing in my mini picture right now.
Well, with that amazing visual description, let's move on. Léonie, I'd love to hear from you about how did you get started? I know your personal journey a little, but I think the world would love to hear it from you.
Thank you. I got started in accessibility by accident, which sometimes sounds a little strange for people who know me, because I began my career just around the time the web was new, and I was a web designer at the time, but then I lost my sight just at the turn of the century. And the logical sort of thought process is that because I lost my sight, accessibility became important. That's what turned it into my career. But it was actually because while I was still trying to get the hang of life as a blind person, I had started to learn how to use my computer again. And I responded to an email from a very new company who said, we've just built our first website for our first customer, but they don't have enough money to do proper usability testing. So if there are any screen reader users out there who could give us, some feedback on this website, we'd be grateful. And I remember thinking, well, I used to be a web designer and I'm definitely a screen reader user now. So sure, why not? And that was a company called Nemensa, who have since become and remain a very influential organization in the accessibility space. And one of the things they were interested in was accessibility. And through that conversation, I realized that this thing called accessibility existed, and kind of really got the bug for wanting to make things better, easier for people to use.
Wow, that's quite a journey. So it's interesting that people very rarely know these things about us, right? And why we get started. Neil, what about you? How did you land up at ATOS and all the other places that you've been at?
So I fell into accessibility like I think most of our generation did, because it didn't exist when we were at school. I've been playing around with assistive tech for about 20 plus years now. I started off working for an organization supplying assistive technology for people with dyslexia. And then about 10, 11 years ago, I ended up working for Siemens, which then bought Atos, which was bought by Atos, working on the BBC account, providing assistive tech and accessibility support. And I've spent the last decade or so trying to embed accessibility and inclusion and practice and policy, etc., into our organization, and doing the same across our customers. And I stayed working for big business because it's a way of leveraging the scale of these organizations to try and make change.
Interesting. So it's interesting that all of us somehow chanced on accessibility. I hope the new lot of people are actually trained in it, so they can hopefully jumpstart some of what we weren't able to do, which brings me to you, Léonie, and web standards. I think all of us have agreed that, web standards is the base for building on accessibility, but it's not the end goal only. It can go way beyond that. So would love to hear from you on how do you see web standards? And I think you were one of the first people, with Steve Faulkner and Andrew Arch and all, that entire group of people who started to focus on web accessibility. So would love to hear about that journey.
Thank you. So accessibility has always been important at the W3C. In fact, it was one of their earliest areas of activity, thanks to Mike Paciello, who was one of the architects of the Web Accessibility Initiative. Judy Brewer became its first director. But actually, the W3C takes accessibility right across the board very seriously. All of its standards are reviewed for accessibility, privacy, security, all those important kind of horizontal perspectives. And that's one of the reasons I've continued to be active at the W3C, is because every single specification goes through that review for accessibility. It's a practical thing. Sometimes, it succeeds, sometimes it doesn't work quite so well, but the intent is definitely there. So, whether it's CSS or SVG or some of the new JavaScript APIs that are coming out, everything gets that review. And I think that's really important. The more we can try and make accessibility part of the standards, the tools that people are using to build things, it's another piece of the puzzle. And I think it's an important one. It's not the only thing, of course, but like I say, it's a piece of the puzzle.
True. But it's also interesting that whenever we talk about accessibility, very often the other standards don't always get talked about. And it's amazing that you mentioned that so clearly, right? And, Neil, so when you take it to business, how does web standards, link into businesses like ATOS and within the delivery mechanism?
Well, pretty much everything is delivered through a browser. So if we want to deliver accessible services to our employees and to our clients, we have to be taking into account web accessibility standards. Yes, there are other things that we need to take into account too, but more and more, our day-to-day work experience or experience of work is delivered through a browser. So standards, and particularly the work of the Web Accessibility Initiative, is tremendously important and impacts on all organizations that we work with.
Right. So Neil, if I was to ask you, and there has always been this thought process that the web standards only relate to visual impairment or screen reader users. And there has always been that myth, so that disconnect that has been there. And within that conversation, I want to bring in neurodiversity into the play. So how do you look at inclusion and people with disabilities from your lens?
So yes, firstly, I have skin in the game because I am neurodivergent. I have dyslexia, ADHD. Those impact how I view the world, how I use and experience technology. I think that there has been a challenge in the understanding of the Web Content Accessibility Guidelines intent. It was never the intent of WCAG to be exclusively for screen reader users or keyboard users. If you look at the underlying principles, it's the core principles: perceivable, operable, understandable, and robust. And understandability is key to cognitive accessibility. So I think that it's always been in there. They just tended to be in the bits that everyone ignored, which is the AAA sections, the bits that were too hard to do. So, and to a certain extent, some of that's still true, because actually cognitive accessibility and neurodiversity is really wide. It's also really, really diverse, and we have opposing needs. So it makes it really hard to make stuff that is really sort of measurable and therefore testable. So some of those things make it more difficult. It doesn't mean that the intent is there to exclude neurodivergent people. Far from it. There's been work ongoing for a long time. I think that it's an interesting time to be looking at this, because we are now nearly 2 years into a completely changed way of working, where people have been forced to work from home, change how they interact. And many of the things that were impactful for neurodivergent people are now also impacting the wider working population. So there is suddenly this sort of great awakening as to sort of cognitive load and overload and so on. And sort of fragmentation of messaging and all of these kind of things. So I think that there is a new recognition of the importance of design and information architecture that is coming back around. So I think that these kind of things are really, really important for neurodiversity. I think that there is still an awful lot in how we design stuff where you can be technically accessible and still really inaccessible for neurodiversity, because a lot of it is around visual design and signifiers and allowing people to understand the affordances that are in the technology. And so if we don't make stuff clear, then people aren't going to be able to use it. So one of the biggest challenges is the design trend of minimalism, because it essentially minimizes the number of people that can use your tech. As soon as stuff disappears from menus, so as soon as I don't have visible buttons and a flow and something to remind me that the feature is there, I am lost. And millions of people like me are lost. So the challenge for designers and for people creating technology is, how do you make stuff obvious and visible when you have thousands of features and lots of different permutations? So I'm not saying that this is easy, but how you present that information in a contextually relevant way really impacts on cognitive accessibility, and therefore, but also usability for the vast majority of our population.
That's interestingly said. I love the approach that you've taken of the minimalist approach, and how that might have challenges per se, and the world is surely shifting in the way that it's looking at things. So Léonie, when you look at, and you've been working in web accessibility for a long time, and specifically also being a screen reader user yourself, so how do you look at explaining to the world that accessibility is about cross disability, and how do you get them to understand that from your perspective?
I tend to try and approach it with a bit of a joke almost. I often say to people, yes, I'm a screen reader user, but no, I am not the poster child for accessibility, because you're right, for too many years, and still now, if you ask someone about accessibility, the first person they'll think of is a screen reader user. So I do very often now just make the point, quite clearly up front. Yes, I'm one of the people, but I'm by no means the only sort of people, or even, a significantly large number of the audience. As Neil just pointed out, people who are neurodivergent have cognitive disabilities. That there are many, many more people in that particular group or set of groups than there are in screen reader users. Other than that, I just try and keep, every time I talk to someone, demonstrate something, talk about accessibility, I try not to think of it in terms of my own disability, and just reference other needs, other things that people benefit from, and just by repetition more than anything, keep trying to reinforce the message that there's an awful lot of people out there with an awful lot of different requirements, and we need to do our best to think about all of them if we can.
So, when we look at 1 billion plus people with disability worldwide, and we all get asked this question of where is the business case for this, right? There is a latest report, I think it's by Forrester, if I'm not mistaken, which talks about the accessible design business requirements, right? And how businesses are going to now start working with organizations that are looking at inclusion from a design perspective. So when you hear something like that, what goes through your mind, and what are you hoping for the future of tech?
I'm waiting for the day when we stop asking for a business case for doing this, to be honest with you, and it just becomes part of the cost of doing business. So
yeah, I'm totally with you. So if if you say that, and if that's how organizations start to look at it, so what do you see the future of tech as?
Oh, that's an awfully big question. The future of tech generally around accessibility, I think voice is going to become much, much bigger. Not just from an accessibility point of view, but just generally. Although, of course, some people do find interacting through speech and conversation difficult if you can't either speak or hear the other side of the conversation. That represents problems. But for lots of people, a conversation is a much easier form of interaction than trying to remember gestures on a touch screen or keyboard commands, or even how to get around an operating system using a mouse. So I suspect we will see more and more of that. I also think we're going to see more artificial intelligence, or at least machine learning, coming into play. We're seeing it creep into assistive technologies like screen readers, for example, where you've got image recognition capability. We're seeing that in browsers too. So I think bit by bit, those two things we're going to start to see more and more of in tech generally, but also within the accessibility space.
What also leads us to think that with all of this, machine learning and artificial intelligence, is accessibility becoming more ubiquitous with mainstream technology? And what's your opinion on that from a design perspective?
For me, yes, I think it is very much becoming part of the mainstream, if we can call it that. If I think back to my early days in accessibility, and I'm sure you'll both have memories of this yourselves, text-only websites were the answer to accessibility for a long time. We'll just take out all the pictures and we'll make the text really simple, and that'll solve the problem, right? And now, I happened to go and look in my iPhone settings the other day, and there's just so much they've done, in a mainstream device that you can adapt it, customize it, change it, personalize it, and in ways that are really beneficial from an accessibility point of view. And I think that's, one extreme to the other. We've now got devices that millions of people have got in their pockets that, right in the very design of the device is a whole bunch of customization that can be done around the idea of accessibility. And, the lines have been blurring for a long time. As a screen reader user, I like things that speak to me. I now have, a Home Assistant device that can do something pretty similar in a different mode. So people are getting used to, that conversational interface. People who've been using speech recognition for mobility, disability reasons, that's the other part of that more and more people are getting used to doing now. So yeah, I think we are starting to see it really coming together into a whole that you can't pick apart, really.
I keep, somebody asked me within BarrierBreak, what do you see the future of BarrierBreak? I said, I'm waiting for the day that we don't exist as a company.
Yes.
Right. I think we all keep saying that to each other, right? We're waiting for that day, but we don't exist. But I think it's interesting to see that progression, right? And Neil, from your perspective, right, when you talk about technology getting so much accessibility support now inbuilt into it, what do you see it? How do you see it from a design perspective, and how do you see it from the future of tech perspective?
So I think that design follows trends a lot of the time, and that we've had a nearly decade of very flat design, which was necessitated for ease of scaling on screens, but that actually made it quite difficult in terms of those signifiers and affordances that I talked about earlier. Whereas skeuomorphism was a great way of people being able to bridge the physical and digital divide. So I think that there may be some kind of re-swinging of the pendulum towards stuff that is more easily interpretable between the physical and the digital worlds. And that I think that particularly when we think about sort of immersive technologies, when you're looking at AR, XR, mixed realities and so on, that sort of need for stuff to be obvious, to know how you're going to interact with it is going to be quite important. I've been shouting at computers for about 20 years. My first job in assistive tech was working with speech recognition, and I'm a speech recognition user because of my dyslexia. It is pretty much ubiquitous now. It's technology embedded all around us. And yet I still think that there's significant work to be done, not so much in the recognition of the language, but in natural language processing and how we create these natural user interfaces, because the actual recognition is really, really good. But for the computers to understand the intent and to have that kind of conversational engagement is still missing. Now, I think that would be the really great leap in terms of usability of speech tech. Now, at the moment, you've got your Alexas and your HomePods and Siris and all of the and the Google devices, etc. You still really have to think about what you're asking them before sort of uttering a command. Otherwise, you probably take 2 or 3 goes for it to work for you. I think when it gets to the stage where it's close enough to a human, and let's face it, sometimes I have to, as a manager, say things 2 or 3 times too. So maybe it's better than I was just alluding to. But when it gets to the point where, for the most part, you can tell the computer to do something and it understands more than just simple commands, but maybe a whole bunch of things, then it's going to be really super useful as an assistive tech. But it will also just then explode and be everywhere, because everybody's going to want to do it because it's better than typing or swiping. So to do that, though, you need to be able to think about how people process information as well, because at the moment, if you ask a computer for something, if you ask Alexa for something, what essentially it does is it reads out a text menu. So you end up with hundreds maybe of different choices, and most people's working memory won't process all of that, let alone someone with a working memory that's shot because they have a cognitive disability. So being able to understand which are the important things and present them to people as part of a conversational interface, I think is going to be really critical. And the other technology I'm super excited about is haptics. We've been talking about haptics for a long time, but I'm talking about sort of mid-air haptics. So actually giving people the illusion of touch and the sense of being able to manipulate things in a tactile way that has been missing for a long time with these sort of flat interfaces and mouse-driven interfaces. So I think that we will be able to use digital technologies to create much more sort of analog, real-world experiences that people can intuitively use. And I think that that's what I'm most excited about the coming tech.
I can see Léonie smiling away at some of your instances. Léonie, any comment?
No, I was just thinking back to actually the question you asked earlier about how I talk about accessibility and explain it, and one of the ways I help people relate to what it's like being an assistive technology user is I ask them, have you ever had a conversation with your home assistant where you've ended up just yelling at it because the conversation didn't go repeatedly the way you wanted it to do? And that's a lot, what accessibility for me is often like. I can kind of get the thing done I want to, but the irritation and frustration involved in kind of getting there is sometimes much more than I'd want it to be. And yeah, to Neil's point, it's absolutely right. The tech's got further to go before this becomes intuitive and natural and easy. But yeah, I think there's some great stuff coming, very much so.
Interesting. Which actually brings me to the accessibility maturity model. Right, and all of us know that organizations are at different stages of accessibility in their accessibility journey. But lately there's this entire conversation of maturity models and how should organizations use it, etc. So thoughts, Léonie?
I think the maturity model always has been a very useful way of framing accessibility at an organizational level. It's incredibly hard. I know both of you know this already, for an organization to really turn its act around when it comes to accessibility. It's very easy to think of, an organization having to get a strategy and then, having to do 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 different steps. But the problem is, of course, that organizations are big and complicated a lot of the time. And, there is not often a direct chain of command through an organization. So it's not as simple as saying, right, we're going to train all our production teams, because those production teams will be split across 6 different cost centers in 3 different parts of the world. And, well, I'm not going to pay for your people to be trained. And, and you get all these just big organizational complexities. So I think the maturity model and the, the resources that exist around it, I think have been extremely helpful in enabling organizations to kind of overcome some of those barriers. So I think it's a good way to look at things. And I think it's a useful resource for organizations too.
Neil, how about you? You've been playing a lot with the models lately and promoting them and talking about them.
Yes, so we've been active members of the Business Disability Forum for decades, and this was one of the originators of one of the earliest maturity models, and we've applied it within our own organization, and we've tweaked it a number of times. And like Léonie says, you can apply it at multiple different levels in an organization. You can do really high level 30,000 foot view and say, well, here are some incremental steps, but we're 110,000 people in 75 countries. We've got 35,000 employees in India in lots of different divisions. So you could apply it at quite a granular level as well. So it's useful. We are using it as part of our group program, looking at different areas, but also we have to take sort of sections of it and segments of it depending on the particular area of business that we're working on. And so what we've also done is, yes, the model's useful, but we also are applying frameworks around how we look at accessibility in our program that have already existed within our organization. So the one that we decided fitted best was around sustainability, because we already have sustainability programs running. Accessibility, disability inclusion are parts and written into the UN Sustainable Development Goals. And we have a governance structure around it. And if you listen to people that are talking about sustainability now, they're not talking about just the environment. I know it's COP26 this last couple of weeks, but actually when you go and look at sustainability, we're talking about ESG, that's environment, environment, social and governance, right? So accessibility is the social and the governance part of that. And also, if we make our environment really bad, it's going to really adversely affect people with disabilities. So what we're doing is we're following that, because it's something that the business already understands, and there are metrics and there are frameworks for doing it. So wherever possible, I try and follow a path that's already been trodden, so that we don't have to sort of go against the flow, and we adapt it, and we take mental models that people can process and synthesize, so that they can embrace us more quickly.
You know, what I've loved about today's conversation is that earlier on, we used to only talk about web accessibility and websites being accessible. And suddenly the conversation has become so diverse and interesting that, you know, there is so much more to it than just making that one website accessible. You know, that is kind of the base of where we start from. So I think, you know, with that, I am seeing that we are at 4 minutes, you know, to our time. So what I would love to hear from you, Léonie, is, you know, nuggets of advice that you have for the people listening in, what would you tell people who are on this journey? And the same thing will apply to you, Neil. So Léonie, we'll start with you.
I would say take a deep breath, do what you can, and try not to be overwhelmed by the thought of all that you have to do. If you're thinking about sustainable accessibility and organizational accessibility, it's really easy to look ahead and just think, oh my goodness, there is just too much to do, we're never going to turn this around. Try very hard not to do that. As Neil mentioned, break things down, get as granular as you can, because every change you make will have an impact somewhere to somebody. And bit by bit, if you can keep doing that, you will slowly but surely find that at an organizational level you're making a difference. And the same applies if you're an individual practitioner. Just learn a little bit more every day, use a new tool every so often, change your habits so that you're just making small changes, and bit by bit you'll make enormous progress, to the extent where one day you'll look up and realize that the only way you know how to do things is the accessible way. It's become second nature to you, and that's a really good place to try and get to.
That's a dream for all of us. Neil?
Yeah, I agree with Léonie. I think that if we were to use an analogy, organizational accessibility programs are a bit like oil tankers, but we're tugboats. We might be small, but we can turn those oil tankers with a bit of persistence. and although I've been here plugging away within the organization for about 11 years, we have, when I look back, made progress. I started as a single person. We now have a program with and a team and a responsibility and roles within the organization that sit in the right place in the hierarchy for it to make a difference. It gets reported on at board level, and we now have hundreds of people that aren't accessibility specialists making what Hector Minto described on Friday, and I thought it was lovely, as a micro commitment to accessibility. So just starting to make little changes. And when you've changed the culture like this, and it's the cultural change that's the important one, because it's the winning the hearts and minds, then everybody starts to do a little bit. And that's when you start to get this big organizational change that will really make a difference.
Well, listening to both of you, I hope people are inspired and want to make this change and want to, move the tempo and, move everything that they can to make things accessible. I think the future is inclusive tech for sure. And I think they have a lot to learn from both of you. So thank you, both of you, for being here, sharing your amazing thoughts. It's been an amazing conversation. We've gone, I think, all around from varied topics, and I'm looking forward to seeing what both of you do and all the progress that we can all make in the world. Thank you. Thank you to both of you.
Thank you, Shilpi, and also for your contribution to accessibility too, which has been considerable.
Thank you, Léonie. Thanks, Neil. Grishma, over to you.
Thank you so much for helping us, with the mission of not only making India accessible, but also the world. We are humbled to be part of this group.